Nell, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for having me here today. I'll make some remarks about the, as you might imagine, about the Russia-Ukraine crisis and what it portends. I think there was a dinner last night and a session last night which asked the question whether or not this will things ever be the same again effectively. I don't myself think that they probably will be. I do think that this marks a significant watershed in global affairs. And I thought I would just sort of kind of flag a few of those that we have identified and then talk a little bit about some of the emerging responses to them. And I should say, I think as a first off, we did our integrated review around this time last year. And it was pretty much the first thing I did when I started being the National Security Advisor. And very many of the themes that we have been seeing played out were actually prefigured in that. So we think that the sort of analysis that we've done was sort of kind of broadly correct. What we haven't realized was quite how quickly they were going to be accelerated. I mean, the Russia-Ukraine crisis has had a sort of galvanic effect on some of these issues. So we will need to come up with answers sort of collectively pretty quickly. So some of the things that I think we can see which are emerging from Russia-Ukraine are sort of manifestation of chronic state competition at the most extreme end of the spectrum. I say most extreme end of the spectrum. There are, of course, more alarming scenarios that people paint. I don't personally believe that we're on the verge of those, but we are certainly seeing violence on the European mainland, which none of us expected to see at this kind of intensity or scale. And that is something in its own right that we need to take seriously. I think it is making a significant effect on the reinforcement of the unity of the West. There's been a lot of conversation about sort of Europe versus US, and so actually what has happened here is I think that has clarified some of those debates. Helpfully, issues about sort of kind of European strategic autonomy, they are to a certain extent sort of taking a backseat to what are much more pressing concerns, and they have welded the West together in an important way, which is not to say that cracks can't emerge, because they can, and we need to make sure that they are kept in bounds. But we can see this with sort of kind of NATO expansion, the sanctions regimes, and so on. Third thing I think I would just observe, which we need to think about, is that defense spending is now on the rise. The sort of revisionist powers, certainly in terms of their own spending capability, have been investing very, very heavily in military and defense and security capabilities over the last 10 or 20 years or so, Russia, China. We can now see that in Russia's case, not always particularly wisely, but nevertheless, they have been investing very, very heavily. This crisis, I think, is inevitably going to mean that very considerable more money is going to be spent by broadly democratic allies on defense spending, and that in its own right is likely to have a bit of a knock-on effect, and we are going to probably be moving into another era of proliferation. So I think there's a question about mass in conventional weapons, but there are also unconventional weapons as well. So we will need to be careful about that, and we will need to think of an architecture which can control it in a way that we don't quite have at the moment. I think there's also a return to a dynamic where middle ground, non-aligned states and actors become absolutely critically important. And again, I think probably the West, and I will using the West as shorthand, but you know what I mean. I don't mean just the sort of kind of geographical West. Will have to accept that we are slightly behind some of the other countries who have been investing in some of those states, and we will need to find an answer to that. And then lastly, we are severe food security crisis, which will hit some very volatile areas of the world, most notably North Africa, and possibly an energy crisis, and some very, very severe economic headwinds, all of which also have an ability to destabilize. We're going to need to respond to those as well. So that is not a particularly cheery picture, but it is one, at least, that we have, as I say, been analysing, not just in the UK, but elsewhere as well, for quite a long time. But it is taking shape sort of pretty much in front of our eyes. What are some of the components of our plan? The IR, the Integrated Review's conclusions, are very much still relevant, but we need to make sure that we are following them through as UK and with allies as quickly as possible. The first thing to do is to make sure that Ukraine succeeds insofar as it can, and that we continue to strengthen NATO and its neighbours. And we need to give real meaning to the phrase deterrence by denial. I'm afraid it is inevitably the case that you have to conclude that what we have seen in Ukraine is a failure of deterrence. And that we need to address that, and we need to re-establish deterrence, not just for Russia. In a more proactive and I think slightly more sympathetic way with some of those middle ground countries. I am struck by how the United Nations in particular is doing a reasonable job of calling out the gross violations of the international order that we can see in front of us, but it's not uniform by any stretch of the imagination. And we need to make sure that those countries which feel that they cannot ally with us at the moment feel more comfortable about doing so. And I think that probably means that we need to be a bit more sympathetic to other forms of governance. I myself, I know why it's a sort of helpful shorthand. I myself am not particularly attracted to, democracy on one side and autocracy on the other, and sort of kind of nothing in between. That is not the situation that a lot of people that we need to have as friends have as a sort of kind of form of governance. So we need to engage with that. We need to engage with their very real needs and aspirations in a way that they will find sympathetic. And thirdly, I think that we need to modernize our approach to multilateralism in a strategy that is focused on future frontiers, that increase our economic interest and strategic interests in the UK, emerging technology, or the Arctic, for instance, which are not yet established but are are changing pretty fast. I think we need to do something in the UK that we've historically been very good at, which is to offer bold ideas about how we can organise ourselves, and indeed the rest of the world can organise itself. Is this a moment to establish a new global climate architecture? That's the kind of thing that we might consider doing, just as the UN was established in the 40s. How do we re-establish arms controlled architectures? We need to start thinking about that stuff as well. I mentioned it before, we need to look beyond sort of kind of some of the more straightforward the Western democratic alliances in order to be able to build alliances elsewhere in the world. The world has shrunk, there's no question about that. We're already doing quite a bit of that, and we're doing it with AUKUS, which has obviously been in the news, but the UK is also pursuing ASEAN status. We're thinking about who we're going to build our future jets with, not thinking about the UK particularly, but the Quad, Japan, India, Australia, US, I'm delighted to see becoming a more potent body. We've got a we've got a Northern European Joint Expeditionary Force thing, which started off militarily, is very rapidly changing into a political vehicle as well. These are the kinds of things that I think that you're going to see more of, and we should see more of, and we should welcome. And lastly, and it links back to the former session, which is to work together with big tech, where the competition is playing out globally, and our interests are aligned. So it seems to me that the debate in a way is a bit like where the climate change debate was 20 years ago. It's not a question of is I was saying earlier on that whenever I come into this room, I always think to myself, this decor is the kind of decor that Vladimir Putin would absolutely love. So I hope that wasn't it. So we can see that in the internet a bit at the moment. We can see that some of the sanctions that the West is putting on Russia at the moment are making the financial systems become a bit more disconnected as well, which on the whole is not a good thing. And we need to think that through. I will stop because I'm running out of time, really. But I mean, moments of resetting the international order have usually come about after a descent into uncontrolled chaos, which is something that we absolutely have to avoid at this point because of the nature of the weaponry that is available to many states around the world. I don't think that we can stop the momentum to a new kind of order. We just need to recognize that, but we do need to recognize this moment for what it is and try and deal with it. What is absolutely clear is that nobody's going to be able to do it alone. I think it is noticeable that Russia and China are getting closer together. That is obviously a marriage of convenience, if it is that, but they operate a sort of kind of hub and spoke model of sort of international influence. They don't really have allies in the sense that we do. There are lots of people who don't want to offend Russia and China for very obvious reasons, but they don't really have any sort of kind of proper allies. We absolutely do. That is not true of the West. It is not true of the free world. The proliferation of these multilateral, minilateral arrangements, I think, is a manifestation of that. But the strongest manifestation for me in my working life is the US-UK relationship. It is the strongest muscle in the sort of kind of body, and of that, the Marshall Scholars is a very, very strong sinew. So I'm delighted to be here talking to you all today, albeit about a slightly forbidding picture. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Greg Miller. I work for the Washington Post. I'm an investigative correspondent based here in London. I work out of a flat that looks a lot like this room, I think. So, Stephen, I want to pick up with some words that you just used about the topic that is at on the front of all of our front pages today, Ukraine. You said that the West needs to make sure that Ukraine succeeds insofar as it can. Can I ask you to elaborate on that qualifier you put at the end of that sentence? I mean, the extent to which Ukraine succeeds depends in some significant measure on decisions made by your government, by the United States and other Western allies. What do you think, and this comes on the heels of conversations in the past couple of weeks about suggestions that Ukraine should be prepared to cede some territory while suing for peace, something that Vladimir Zelensky seems not interested in whatsoever. What did you mean by that? What should Ukraine look like at the end of this conflict? And how can your government go about achieving that?
Well, the policy of the government, and it's one to which I completely fully subscribe, is that Ukraine should have its territorial integrity re-established in its entirety. And that is something that as a policy objective, we have very clearly in mind. I mean, having said that, the American president has been very clear that NATO is not going to get involved qua NATO in a fight in Ukraine. And to a very large extent, therefore, the progress of the conflict is going to be dependent on Ukrainian will, which is going to be very amply and has already been very amply reinforced by Western money, munitions, and support. I mean, I'm obviously sort of kind of aware of the realpolitik view that Ukraine ought to accept the inevitable and to give up a chunk of its eastern territory to make the Russians go away. I think that there are some very, very significant problems with that proposition, to put it mildly. In the first place, it is accommodation is escalatory. You know, it's like feeding hamburgers to sharks. You know, it's a waste of a hamburger and it just encourages the shark. I mean, there is absolutely no reason to believe that pursuing an approach like that is going to somehow or other lead to peace, because I just don't think that there is, as I say, there's no evidence to demonstrate that that's the case. And the way in which Russia has behaved so far would give nobody any confidence that that is the case. The other massive problem with that particular view is that it's not up to us, it's up to the Ukrainian people. And I think there are 43 million of them who would find it abhorrent now, having seen what Russia has done to their country, to acquiesce in an annexation of part of their land. And I don't think it's the business of any government to encourage them that that's what they should do. Quite apart from the fact that they just wouldn't do it. You know, the UK has no very strong views on what the territory of Ukraine sort of kind of ought to look like. I think that is ultimately a question for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. But at the moment, it's pretty clear what it is. They want the whole thing back.
I want to use a few more words that came out of your mouth, not today, but not that long ago. You were speaking.
That sounds alarming.
You were speaking. No, I think it will seem prescient. In fact, wars aren't won by numbers of troops or weaponry alone. The collapse of the larger and better equipped military showed the importance of psychological factors like morale, expectations, and faith in political leadership. You weren't talking about the government of Russia in this case, the military of Russia. You were talking about the military of Afghanistan, which the West had spent a couple of decades trying to build into a formidable power. And it occurs to me that during your time as national security advisor, we've seen, you know, the West engage in a fairly disastrous retreat from a war in Afghanistan, and Russia, another global power, launch a disastrous war. We've gone from sort of having some inclined to write obituaries for NATO to describing it as something with new resolve, new purpose. Can you help us sort out this whiplash and what you think we might be saying about all this a year from now?
Well, I hope you're not going to be saying that the common denominator of those two things that I was in post for both of them. So actually, curiously, as I was walking over from the Cabinet Office, I was reflecting on exactly that point. We got some things wrong in the analysis in Afghanistan. Not just the UK, the US, Germany, everybody who's involved in it. Not actually, the things that we didn't get wrong were that we thought that the government would collapse and ultimately there would be a Taliban government. And actually, although you described it as a disastrous evacuation, it was very distressing scenes and it was very, very difficult to work on. As a purely tactical exercise of extracting a hell of a lot of people, it was a great success. I mean, we thought we were going to get out 6,000, we got out 15,000. So I'm very proud of my colleagues, both here and there and in Afghanistan, who enabled that to happen. Having said that, the two things I think that, the thing that a couple of things link the two situations. One is morale. There was, it turned out to be no morale in the formal Afghan forces, and they melted away in a way that we didn't anticipate. And the ability of its leadership and the faith in its leadership meant that that was going to happen. And when that happens, there is a problem. I think in Russia, you can see, in Russia, Ukraine, you can see the exact sort of kind of thing playing out in reverse. The Ukrainian morale has proved to be sort of a thing of sort of kind of awe-inspiring immensity, which is not to say that we had doubts that they thought that they were Ukrainian and so on. We just didn't know quite what the strength of national feeling is, and that is now greater than it ever was. We can also see very considerable evidence of catastrophic morale in certain bits of the Russian military, which I think we, on the whole, slightly overestimated. You know, they're not 10 foot tall. They may have spent a lot of their time over the last 20 years re-establishing their military and investing in new weapon systems, but they don't necessarily always work. And part of the reason for that is that they do not have the kind of fighting spirit that is required to make those things work. So I think there is something about morale. And the other thing I would say is I think in both instances, it shows the limitations of seeking to impose upon a very different culture a conception of your culture stroke mode of governance. We didn't work. It didn't work for us in Afghanistan. It didn't work for the Russians in Afghanistan before them. It's not working for the Russians now in Ukraine. And I think we need to be humble in front of that fact.
That's interesting. You and others have spoken today about Western resolve, and by many measures, it has been impressive. I would like to ask you about how long you think that can be sustained. There are experts on conflict, experts on Russia, who believe that time may actually be in Putin's favor, that soaring energy prices will sap Western resolve, that political developments in Western countries, including the United States, will fragment this sense of purpose. What are your views about the West's ability to sustain this focus if this goes on into it next year and beyond?
I feel reasonably confident about that. People said that 2022 was inevitably going to be a rerun of 2014. Well, gossip, it wasn't. It hasn't been. I mean, there was an old phrase. It was in the Financial Times today. Somebody was quoting it. Is the economy stupid? Well, actually, I don't think it is just the economy stupid. There are other factors which drive governments and populations and citizens other than merely financial and economic pressures. Germany has done a whole bunch of things, which I think 6 months ago, nobody would have conceived that it was going to be capable of doing. And they're definitely not in a pure sense in its economic interest. Nevertheless, it's doing them. And I'm not saying that the concept of Western unity is a given. It isn't. It isn't going to be maintained by accident. But there is very considerable work going on, as you can imagine, in a lot of different capitals to make sure that it sticks together. The other thing I would say is that these sanctions and the pressure that the Russian economy is under is, the ability to wait it out is, works both ways. I mean, it's going to be very, very difficult for the Russians to keep bits of their economy going without Western machinery going in, and so on and so forth. So, it's a different economy. It can work as a siege economy better than ours can, but nevertheless, these are unprecedented measures.
You mentioned China in your remarks, and its bonds, increasing ties with Russia, at least perhaps in the way it sees its interests unfolding in the world. You recently were responsible for evaluating the national security implications of the sale of the UK's largest semiconductor company to a firm that is ultimately owned by China, a deal that others don't think should go through. The former head of MI6 has spoken about this. The former head of UK cybersecurity has been adamantly opposed. Can you talk about why you reached the conclusion that you did, and the broader context of China as a global rival?
The first thing I would say is that the review that I did for the Prime Minister has not been made public.
Okay.
And I am aware that people have reported upon it as if they knew what the conclusions of it were.
You can disabuse us.
Yeah,
All of these inaccuracies.
They are inaccurate.
Okay.
And I'll just leave that where it is. And the second thing is that you will have noticed that on the 25th of the month, i.e. last week, that particular transaction was called in by the Business Secretary of State in order to be looked at more thoroughly. And any number of different remedies if he chooses to, if he comes to a conclusion in his quasi-judicial role that it's unsafe for national security, any number of different remedies are available to him. With all that throat clearing out of the way, we have historically and will in the future, I have absolutely no doubt, want to encourage Chinese investment and indeed other investment into parts of the UK economy. When it is being done safely, when it is not harming UK interests, is something that we welcome. We're an open economy and would want to stay that way. China is an economic superpower. The idea of sort of kind of disengaging from China, I think, strikes me as being delusional, really. So we will always be a bit nuanced, but as I say, I wouldn't assume that everybody knows exactly what the contents of private advice to the Prime Minister might contain.
Duly noted. Thank you. I think I have time for one more question, and then we will see if we can slip in a quick one from the audience. And I think it would be relevant to this gathering, this organization, this esteemed group of scholars. I want to ask you about the special relationship and the status of that special relationship between the United States and the UK. And forgive me, but I'm going to try to play devil's advocate because I really want to hear your sincere thoughts about this. So that relationship is now with a country where a substantial part of the population professes to believe that the last presidential election was stolen, and that democratic mechanisms should be tossed aside to rectify that error. Where white nationalism is ascendant, and in some measures, women's rights are in retreat, where the government can't bring itself to protect school children from mass shootings, and where the former and potential future president at times seemed determined to eradicate NATO. How special does that feel? How does the directions, how do these directions in US politics affect, if at all, how special that relationship remains? Because you've spoken even starting today as the most important muscle in the body.
Some of the things that you've described there are clearly causing you, no doubt, people in this room, Americans, and indeed people in the rest of the world, some degree of consternation. I'm not going to sort of try and give opinions about sort of American politics, because I don't think that is my place. But what I would say is that before I'd been doing this job, which I've now done for 18 months, I ran the Ministry of Defense for 5 years, and those 5 years encompassed all of the Trump administration. And notwithstanding that, you know, he said what he said about NATO, some of the social trends that you described sort of kind of were put in motion in those times. As a defense and security relationship, it never missed a beat. It is by far and away the closest relationship that America has relationships with everybody, but the one that it has with the UK in a whole host of different ways is way closer than any other. And I do think that you can see that in the announcement of AUKUS, as a matter of fact. I mean, I hope there aren't any French people in the room, because I know that's a sensitive subject. But the idea that the UK and the US, who have been collaborating on nuclear technology for 64 years, would together decide have the same geostrategic analysis, such that they would then decide that partnership should be generously and openly extended to Australian colleagues, I think tells you something about the relationship, which it would be impossible for me to imagine America would want to have with another country. So it is still vitally important to us, notwithstanding, as you say, I mean, you know, as I say at the end of Some Like It Hot, nobody's perfect, are they?
I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Sir Stephen, thank you so much for your time today.